Hi guys, this is Don Tickner, and today I'll be taking you through some extended gameplay from my science fiction roguelike As You Wake. I'll also be commenting on it as we go. My commentary isn't actually going to match what you're seeing, as I'll be talking about the game in depth. If you would like to see this gameplay footage without my commentary, just click the link on your screen. This footage is recorded from the current pre-alpha version of As You Wake, and there's a couple of bugs and glitches that you're going to see in here, so please keep in mind that this is not finished and not representative of the final game. As I mentioned, As You Wake is a science fiction roguelike. It's inspired by one of my favourite films, a James Cameron film called Aliens. It's also inspired by another of my favourite films, John Carpenter's The Thing. But in both of those films, the protagonists face off against an evolving and hyper-intelligent enemy. And it's really sort of this exploration of being alone and being hunted. And that idea of being alone in the dark and being hunted by an intelligent enemy that can outthink you, is the central theme of As You Wake. This little intro, the quote from Leon C. Megginson surmising Charles Darwin's theory of evolution, as well as this text that you're seeing here, should set up those themes and ideas for the player to help draw them into the world a little bit and get them ready for what they're about to play through. Although the game has a horror atmosphere, it's not designed to be sort of jump scares and really shocking to the player. It doesn't use realistic graphics and that sort of thing. It's really designed to create this atmosphere, this tension, and have that be the source of the player's fear, as opposed to being scared about things jumping out at them. This little intro, I think, sets that up really well for the player, and I actually enjoy having it on, even after many playthroughs. The text itself has many variations, of course. As You Wake has a couple of key features that really separate it from other roguelikes, and the first is this sort of evolving and adaptive enemy, and this works in two key ways. The first way is that the game is actually watching what you're doing. Specifically, it's checking what weapons you're using, what skills you're favoring, what abilities you have, and it's also sort of determining how the player is using them. It then takes this information and uses it to inform enemy selection choices when it generates the next level. So it'll look at the player's weapon choice, for example, and determine that they're using a melee weapon, and it'll then select enemies to populate the next level that provide a greater degree of challenge for melee-based players. And this is, of course, coupled with looking at the skills and the abilities the player have, and again selecting enemies that provide the greatest degree of challenge to combat the player's selected play style. Deliberately attempting to counter the player's play style provides a different type of challenge than most roguelikes. This isn't a game about necessarily having the best weapons or the best armor or even the most health. It's about outthinking your opponent and being able to use tactics and use your abilities in ways that allow you to effectively combat the enemy and what they're doing. This ties neatly into the artificial intelligence system that I've built for As You Wake, which is more advanced than you'd find in your typical roguelike. In most roguelikes, the enemies are bound entirely by line of sight, and they simply sort of rush towards the player, maybe use a special ability or two, and then basically die. They're not terribly advanced. In As You Wake, I've gone several steps further than that in order to sort of create this atmosphere of an intelligent enemy, by actually providing an intelligent enemy for the player to face off against. So initially the enemy are bound just by line of sight. On this first level, they can only see the player. Later on in the game, they gain the ability to hear the player, so they'll be able to hear you opening doors and opening cupboards and looking for supplies, and be drawn to that sound. Eventually their hearing becomes so sensitive that they can even hear the player's footsteps, and the player can actually take off their shoes to make no noise at all and sort of walk around these sort of blind enemies, and it creates sort of ways for them to manipulate the artificial intelligence, but also provide sort of unique gameplay in the context of a roguelike. Further on in the game, the enemies even gain the ability to smell the player. Although you can't see it here, the player is actually leaving a scent trail around the level, and it propagates as a scent trail should, so it builds up very quickly in enclosed environments, and it dissipates very quickly in more open environments. These methods of detection allow the artificial intelligence to work together, so different types of enemies can detect the player in different ways, and then they can communicate to each other. So an enemy that can smell you, for example, might follow your scent trail till it finds you, and then it might make noise to attract all of the other enemies nearby and draw them to your location. This makes stopping those sorts of enemies very important to the player in order to ensure their survival. Different methods of detection isn't the only thing that the artificial intelligence in As You Wake can do. It works together. Each individual enemy is an agent of the AI system, and they're unique in that system, so they can operate independently, but they can also operate as groups. And as their intelligence level increases as the player progresses through the game, they can form complex groups and even complex strategies based on the makeup of their groups. So for example, they might determine that the player is trying to target a particular type of enemy, such as an enemy that can smell them, and then use this type of enemy as bait to lure the player into an ambush. So you might be chasing this enemy down a corridor, and then all of a sudden 2 doors will open and enemies will spew out to attack you and trap you. Even on the first level, they have a basic understanding of the concept of a bottleneck and can work the player into a situation where they're trapped from both ends of a corridor. As the game progresses, the enemies become more intelligent and gain access to different and new abilities. So for example, they gain the ability to analyze a given situation and determine their potential success. So they might look at the player and determine that based on the player's weapon and the player's health, they can't defeat the player. So they'll run away. And in the process of running away, if they're intelligent enough, they might try and find other enemies to group up with and form a little hunting party to then go back out and try and find the player. And this is all part of the horror narrative of being alone in the dark and being hunted. And instead of trying to just throw hundreds of enemies at the player and have them have lots of health and damage, I've actually tried to build enemies that hunt and enemies that try and find the player and outthink the player to provide that real atmosphere, that real environment, and really hone in on that terrifying feeling of being trapped in a room surrounded by enemies and knowing there's potentially no way out of this situation. Coupled with the permanent death of a roguelike, it creates a fairly high degree of tension, even for me, even having made the game. There's still moments where I realize, oh crap, the AI has outthought me, trapped me, and I'm going to die. One of the first questions I'm asked about the artificial intelligence is how can the player fight back? If the artificial intelligence is as advanced as I say it is, then how can the player defeat it? And the simple fact is that this is a predictable artificial intelligence. This isn't some super advanced neural net that is learning from the player every single time the player plays the game. The AI is predictable, and as such, it can be manipulated. Utilizing the systems of the game, such as its ability to hear, the player can take their shoes off to fool the enemy into thinking they're somewhere that they're not, or they can use the invisibility biomod to literally walk around enemies and the enemies won't even know that they're there. And these systems allow the player to force the AI to make mistakes. So the AI will put itself in a situation where the player can take advantage of it, maybe that forces the enemy to group up, and they can lob a grenade in amongst them and take out several enemies at once. Manipulating the artificial intelligence is the primary skill that the player develops over several playthroughs of As You Wake. So the very first time that the player plays the game, they're not entirely sure what the AI is capable of or how to manipulate it. On the 100th playthrough, they know exactly how to make the AI do whatever it is that they want, and that enables them to succeed across multiple playthroughs, even though they're essentially fighting different enemies every time. Now, the enemy evolution system in As You Wake does not generate entirely new enemies. It's not a procedural enemy generation system. It simply selects from enemies that I've handcrafted, and it's a small pool of about 7 or so enemies for any one level, and it uses this pool to get a best fit for the player. And because it's not an exact match, because it's not building brand new enemies that are deliberately, specifically targeted for this exact player, there's holes in the enemy's ability roster. So the player might encounter enemies that are designed to fight against a ranged opponent, but they don't take into consideration the player's shockwave ability or the player's teleport biomod. And this allows the player to fight back against an AI that is designed to target them, but not them specifically. And that sort of weakness is something that the player needs to learn to take advantage of. With this type of artificial intelligence system and adaptive enemies, one of the core challenges of designing As You Wake is keeping the game fair for the player at all times. And it's easy to give the AI all of these crazy abilities and just say that the player has to adapt. But you have to design them in such a way that the player can adapt to them. And any features that the AI have that the player can't really take into consideration or take advantage of are essentially removed to keep the game feeling fair at all times. For example, one of the features of the artificial intelligence that I was most proud of was that later in the game, when the enemies become more intelligent, I gave them the ability to locate and equip weapons and armor in the same way that the player does. And the thinking behind this was that if they're so intelligent, if these enemies are supposed to be so advanced, then of course they would be able to use the same items and weapons that the player could. But this led to situations that were unfair. And this occurred when the enemy would encounter the player and analyze them and determine that this enemy and it couldn't defeat the player in this given situation. So they would actually go on the hunt to find a weapon. In the process of looking for a weapon, they would form up groups with other enemies that could also equip weapons, and it would share that instruction. So this group of enemies would go out and find shotguns and assault rifles, and then using the ambush ability that they have would set traps for the player. So I would walk into a room and instantaneously die, despite the fact that I had the most health and the best armor, and I was utilizing my abilities as the best that they could be used. I was unable to win. There was simply no way for me to counter that. And so to solve that problem and to keep the game feeling fair at all times, I've actually had to remove that particular ability of the AI, so they can no longer locate and equip weapons and armor. And although, as I said, it was one of my favorite abilities, it's all about that end experience with As You Wake. It's all about being able to outthink your opponent consistently, despite the changing environment or your changing weapons and the changing enemies. Tying into this are the player's attributes, skills, biomods, and equipment. And it's these four systems that empower the player to fight back against the evolution system and against the enemy artificial intelligence. Unlike a lot of role-playing games and other roguelikes, As You Wake is not about character specialization. This isn't about being the best at one or two things. As You Wake is primarily focused on forcing the player to keep their options open. If you focus exclusively on melee weapons, for example, the next level of the game, you're going to encounter enemies that can fight back against melee characters. So you're actually going to need to swap tactics. Now that can mean that you need to find a different weapon, but it can also mean using your abilities in different ways, or perhaps outthinking your opponents, such as locking doors to trap them, or using the items that you find throughout the world to craft new weapons or new items to help you fight back. To help the player swap roles as quickly as possible, most of the pieces of equipment, such as your shoes, your body armor, and your helmets, all have skill adjustments attached to them, so they'll improve your weapon skill, your armor skill. They can also improve your medical skill, allowing better use of the dissection mechanic, or they might improve your mechanical skill, allowing you to open more rooms and desks to find new items, or they might even improve your hacking skill, allowing you to hack into the ship's computer system, including its security system, and take advantage of security turrets to help do the fighting for you. And allowing the player to change focus or change roles using their equipment in combination with their previously selected skills and attributes ensures that this game has a really unique ebb and flow to it. This isn't about just having a particular set of skills and relying exclusively on them. Finding a key piece of equipment can completely change the way you play the game. In addition to these systems are the biomods. At the start of this video we saw that the character used a biomod and was given the choice between two separate abilities. These abilities are usually the sort of heads and tails of a given idea. In this instance, they had the choice between being able to detect all of the enemies in their environment or be hidden from all of the enemies in their environment. And that completely alters the way that you can play the game. Being able to see enemies through walls allows you to sort of plan ahead or avoid an area if you know you can't win, but being able to hide from enemies even in the middle of combat allows the player to either avoid combat entirely or leave combat and re-enter it at whim when they're best prepared to handle it. Each biomod is designed to provide that kind of differentiation to gameplay, and as the player progresses through the game and acquires more biomods and more abilities, it opens up combinations of gameplay and combinations of abilities that fundamentally change the entire gameplay experience for the player. And they have to make those choices while balancing dealing with what's happening immediately around them, as well as planning ahead for the future. So you can't just react to exactly what's happening because you know that next level those enemies are going to adapt to exactly what you've done this level. So you really have to try and keep your options open. And having that predictability in terms of the enemy's adaptation allows the player to even game the evolution system. And one of the early abilities that I found was that if you acquire a firearm early on in the game and don't use it, and simply use melee weapons, when the enemies adapt to the melee weapon that you've been using, you can then instantaneously switch to the firearm and you're already prepared for it. and in fact it allows you to thrive in that particular situation. Now initially I thought that this was perhaps a bad idea and get rid of it, but I actually found that being able to game the evolution system and sort of dictate how the enemy evolves by using particular abilities or holding on to a biomod and not using it until a little bit later on to force enemies to evolve into a particular way is really planning ahead, not just one level, not just 2 levels, but potentially up to 3 or 4 levels ahead. And I really wanted to reward that level of understanding of the game mechanics and that level of forethought. So that's actually still in the game. You can totally manipulate the enemy's evolution and force them to grow and evolve in a way that you can already adapt to. All of these systems in combination create a game where the player can adapt to the enemy and the enemy can adapt to the player. And this repeats itself, it reinforces itself from level to level. So when you adapt to the enemy, say you're using melee weapons and they adapt to that, and then you adapt to the enemies, they then again adapt to you. And this back and forth, this recycling of adaptation, continues and reinforces itself across the entire game. And it creates organic difference. Every single time you play the game, you're going to play it differently. Not because you've elected to say, this is going to be my magic playthrough, or this is going to be my spear playthrough. You play it differently because you have to. And that was to address one of the core problems I have with a lot of the roguelikes that I've played in the past, is that I generally play them the same way every time. And it's not necessarily a conscious choice of, I'm going to play this exactly the same way that I played it last time. It's a matter of finding the path of least resistance. With As You Wake, the path of least resistance changes from level to level, and you have to keep moving, you have to keep adapting to find it. In addition to forcing the player to play differently and to get them outside of their comfort zone, it provides organic difficulty. It doesn't feel like I'm being cheap with, tougher enemies that do more damage. The enemies get smarter, they play better, they make better decisions, and they manipulate the environment in a way that the player has to outthink them as opposed to just find a bigger gun with more bullets. All of the features of As You Wake, from the advanced artificial intelligence to the enemy evolution system, down to the real-time lighting in the game, all help to reinforce the core theme of As You Wake, which is this idea, this concept of being alone in the dark and being hunted by an intelligent enemy. I believe I've been successful in achieving that central goal, because even as I'm playing the game, even as the developer, I feel those moments of tension from time to time. I realize, oh my god, the enemies trap me, and I think, oh crap, how do I get out of this situation? That to me says I've been successful in achieving what I set out to do. I've been developing As You Wake part-time now for about 2.5 years. Every major feature of the game is already finished. The evolution system and the AI system are in the game. I'm simply polishing them and removing the bugs that remain. I've also completed all of the biomods in the game, which is the 16 abilities that the player will gain access to. All of the attributes and skill systems are in the game, fully functional and work exactly the way that I'd like them to. The pre-alpha version of the game that I'm playing here in this video is already in the hands of a couple of testers, and they've already helped me find a few bugs. I'd like to get the proper alpha version of the game out when there's about 5 or so levels of content in the game. This will allow the player to see every major feature and see the AI and the enemy evolution the way that I intended it to, without having to give them a caveat about what's in the game or what's not in the game and what's coming in a future update. Ultimately, As You Wake is the roguelike that I always hoped that somebody else would make. Unfortunately, they never did. As I continue development of As You Wake, I'll be looking at ways to fund that development full time. We're at a point now where I'm down to just creating the content to populate the game, and it's a very time-consuming process to build all of the sprites, all of the enemies, all of the level components, and all of the variations, as well as bug test for the AI and the evolutionary system. This funding will most likely take the form of a crowdfunding campaign, such as Kickstarter or Indiegogo. I haven't actually made any decisions on that. Before there's any kind of crowdfunding push, however, I'll actually be releasing a public demo of As You Wake that you'll be able to download and play and get a feel for the game. It'll be the level that you're seeing that I play through here, as well as the tutorial level, and hopefully there won't be any bugs or glitches, but unfortunately I can't make any promises at this point in development. In addition to all of the gameplay stuff that I've talked about today, I'm also hoping to include sort of visual customization options for As You Wake. Already in the game is a Game Boy pixel shader, a video of which is available on my channel, and this just makes the game look like it was created on the original Game Boy's green dot matrix screen. In the future, I'll be looking at adding pixelated shaders to replicate the look of 8 or 16-bit games, and even grayscale shaders, as well as accessibility options such as a colorblind mode for those out there with vision impairments. This video is going to be finishing up in just a moment, so spoiler alert, the enemy outthink me and trap me in a corridor and kill me in just a few moments' time. I'd like to take a moment to thank you for watching this video. It's been a real pleasure to talk about and demonstrate As You Wake after all these years of development, so I hope you've enjoyed this in-depth look at the game. I'd also like to invite you to visit my website at redtiegames.com.au. This is an ongoing development blog for As You Wake and takes you behind the scenes about how I make the game. If you like what you've seen and would like to see more, subscribe to me here on YouTube for all of the latest videos for As You Wake. For all of the latest announcements in regards to the public demo and crowdfunding campaigns, follow me on Twitter at RedTieGames. I hope you've enjoyed this video and this sort of behind the scenes look at As You Wake and what makes the game tick. Stay tuned for more, and I'll see you next time.